Do you remember the items that were completely normal in the 1970s but would be illegal now? These were the everyday habits, products, and choices that shaped family life, trusted without question and woven into daily routines. But when ordinary memories turn into outlawed relics, what does that say about how much we have really changed? Drinking age of 18 in many states was a reality that shocks people today. In the 1970s, teenagers who had barely graduated high school could walk into a corner store, hand over a few dollars, and buy a six-pack of beer without question. It was legal in dozens of states, and for many, it was a rite of passage. College towns thrived on it, with freshmen celebrating their new freedom not just with dorm parties, but with legal trips to the bar. Parents often shrugged it off as part of growing up, and bartenders rarely turned anyone away as long as they had the cash. The culture of the time simply did not see alcohol as something that needed to be as tightly regulated as it is now. Campaigns against drunk driving had not yet reached their peak, and laws varied widely from state to state. For those who lived through it, the memory of grabbing a beer at 18 still lingers as a sign of how relaxed society once was. It feels almost unthinkable now, but in the 1970s it was just normal life. School field trips without permission slips seem impossible today, but back then it was a common practice. Teachers would gather the class, take a quick head count, and pile everyone onto a bus for a trip to the zoo, a museum, or even a factory tour. There were no stacks of paperwork, no emergency contact lists, and no signed forms tucked into backpacks. Kids were often surprised to find out where they were going only once the bus started moving. Some students came home covered in dirt from farms or dazzled by machinery from factory tours, retelling stories to parents who had no idea the trip even happened. The spontaneity made the day feel like an adventure, adding to the thrill. Parents often did not even know where their kids were going until the child came home with a story to tell. It was a time when trust in schools and teachers was nearly absolute, and communities felt smaller and safer. The idea of liability or lawsuits was far from people's minds, and permission was assumed rather than documented. Looking back, it feels carefree but also risky. Children traveling across town with little more than a roll call to keep track of them. Yet for many kids, these trips became some of their best memories of school, precisely because of that freedom. Drinking and driving viewed casually is perhaps one of the most jarring shifts from the 1970s to now. The phrase "one for the road" was not just a joke, it was an accepted practice. Many cars had built-in ashtrays and even cup holders designed with beer cans in mind. People drove home from bars with open containers in the passenger seat, and no one batted an eye. It was common to see beer cans rolling under seats or tucked in glove compartments, evidence of how normal it was. Even passengers joined in, sipping drinks on highways as if it were no different from having a soda. Roadside checks were rare, and the culture itself downplayed the risks. Police were far less strict, and DUI laws were weakly enforced compared to today. It was not unusual to see someone sip from a can of beer while cruising down the highway. The cultural mindset was shockingly relaxed about the dangers, partly because campaigns about drunk driving had not yet taken hold. Families sometimes even joked about dad having a few too many, but still driving home. Tragic accidents eventually led to tougher laws and greater awareness, but in the 1970s, casual drinking and driving was simply part of the culture. Cars without seatbelts for everyone were the norm in the 1970s. Many vehicles only had lap belts in the front seats, while back seats often had no restraints at all. Children piled into station wagons, sitting on the floor, in trunks, or even stretched out across the back bench seat. Families went on road trips with kids rolling around freely, playing games, or lying down for naps. Some kids even rode with their heads sticking out of windows or sat facing backward, waving at drivers behind them. Others built pillow forts in the back during long drives, completely unbuckled. It was a mix of chaos and freedom that defined family car travel. Parents did not worry about safety harnesses or buckles because the expectation simply was not there. Seatbelts were considered optional at best, and many drivers tucked them behind seats so they would not wrinkle clothes. Campaigns like "Buckle Up for Safety" had only just begun, and it would be decades before seatbelt laws became standard nationwide. Looking back, the thought of driving at highway speeds with an entire family unrestrained is terrifying, but at the time it was just how things were done. Riding in the back of pickup trucks was one of the ultimate thrills of the 1970s. Kids and even adults piled into the open bed, sitting on wheel wells or dangling their legs over the edge as the truck sped down roads and highways. It was seen as harmless fun, a way to pack more people into a vehicle during summer outings, parades, or even just casual drives. No one thought about the lack of safety, and there were no laws stopping it. Children stood up to feel the rush of wind, holding onto the sides as the truck bounced over bumps. Families laughed together on hayrides or waved to neighbors during parades, treating it like a carnival ride. Even dogs joined in, tails wagging as they leaned into the breeze. For children, the wind rushing past and the feeling of freedom made it one of the most exciting rides of their lives. Parents sometimes even encouraged it, especially in rural areas where it was considered part of growing up. Today, the very idea of riding unrestrained in the open back of a truck on a freeway feels reckless and dangerous. But in the 1970s, it was a symbol of carefree childhood. Selling cigarettes to teenagers in vending machines was shockingly normal. These machines were everywhere, in restaurants, bowling alleys, and even outside grocery stores. Teenagers could walk right up, drop in some quarters, pull a knob, and walk away with a pack of cigarettes. No identification was checked, and no one questioned whether the buyer was old enough. For many teenagers, buying from vending machines was their first brush with independence. Groups of kids hung around the machines, daring each other to buy packs just for the thrill. The glowing lights of the machines made them almost inviting, blending in with arcade games and soda dispensers. The machines became hangouts for kids who often bought cigarettes just because they could. For adults, it was a convenience, but for teenagers, it was a loophole that made smoking easy and accessible. Anti-smoking campaigns had not yet taken hold in the way they would in later decades, and the dangers of tobacco were still downplayed in popular culture. By today's standards, the idea of unsupervised teenagers buying cigarettes out of a vending machine feels absurd, but in the 1970s, it was just another part of everyday life. Candy cigarettes marketed to kids showed just how differently the 1970s viewed smoking culture. These chalky, sweet sticks came in boxes that looked exactly like real cigarette packs, complete with brand names and logos. Some even had powdered sugar that puffed out like smoke when you blew on them. Kids mimicked adults by holding them between fingers, lighting them, and pretending to smoke. Parents laughed and took photos, never thinking twice about the message it sent. Playgrounds often turned into smoking lounges, with kids showing off fake packs as if they were grown-ups. Some even argued about which brand tasted better, copying conversations they had overheard from parents. Candy shops displayed them proudly, treating them as just another treat. They were sold right alongside candy bars at every corner store, making them irresistible to children. It was not until much later that society realized how inappropriate it was to encourage kids to play with fake cigarettes. Today, the idea of marketing a candy that mimics smoking seems outrageous, but back then, it was just another example of how normalized smoking was in daily life. Leaving kids home alone as latchkey children was an accepted reality in the 1970s. Parents worked long hours, and childcare options were limited, so kids often came home from school to empty houses. They wore house keys around their necks, let themselves in, and made snacks until parents arrived later in the evening. Television became a babysitter, and frozen dinners filled the gap when kids cooked for themselves. It was not considered neglect, it was simply what families did to make ends meet. Communities trusted that children were responsible enough to handle it, and parents expected independence from a young age. Today, child welfare guidelines and laws would view this very differently, but at the time it was part of growing up. Being a latchkey kid carried a mix of pride and loneliness, teaching responsibility while also reminding kids how much times have changed. Cars without child safety seats were another everyday norm. Infants often rode on a parent's lap, and toddlers bounced around freely in back seats. Some parents placed babies in simple carriers or even laundry baskets on the floor during long drives. On long trips, kids played games in the back, crawling over seats or sitting on the floor without a thought to safety. Parents sometimes stretched out blankets to make the car feel cozier, turning the back seat into a moving playpen. What seemed like family fun then would now make modern parents cringe. There were no strict laws requiring child restraints, and most families never thought twice about it. Car seats did exist, but they were designed more for convenience than safety, often functioning as booster chairs rather than protective devices. Road trips became free-for-alls, with kids climbing from front to back while parents drove. By modern standards, it seems reckless, but in the 1970s, it was just the way things were done. Only later did laws and awareness campaigns make car seats mandatory, changing the way families traveled forever. BB guns and pellet guns, treated as toys, reflected a time when safety concerns were far less strict. Kids received them as birthday presents or bought them with allowance money, then ran into backyards or fields to play wars without goggles or supervision. The guns looked real, fired small projectiles, and caused plenty of injuries, but that never slowed their popularity. Children lined up cans on fences, tested their aim on bottles, and sometimes even shot at each other in mock battles. Bruises, welts, and chipped windows were common, but few parents saw them as serious problems. Instead, BB guns were viewed as a training step before hunting or using real firearms. Parents often shrugged it off as part of childhood, seeing it as a step between toy cap guns and real hunting rifles. Children learned to aim, to shoot at cans or bottles, and unfortunately, sometimes at each other. It was dangerous, but it was also seen as normal, even character building. Today, strict regulations, bright safety markings, and bans on certain models make them far different from what they were. In the 1970s, though, BB guns were simply toys, symbols of a looser and riskier time. Unregulated fireworks in neighborhoods were an explosive part of summer in the 1970s. Cherry bombs, bottle rockets, and Roman candles were sold openly, with little regulation and even less adult supervision. Kids could walk into roadside stands or corner shops, hand over a few dollars, and walk out with fireworks powerful enough to cause serious injury. Backyards lit up with bright sparks, loud bangs, and the smell of gunpowder. Neighbors often joined in, sometimes competing for who could put on the biggest display. Children held sparklers dangerously close to faces, lit firecrackers in tin cans, and chased each other with bottle rockets. Adults cheered them on, seeing the chaos as part of the holiday fun. Injuries were shrugged off with bandages, and the celebrations carried on year after year. Parents stood by with minimal concern, watching children light fuses with matches or lighters. It was thrilling and dangerous, and every summer carried stories of burns, missing fingers, or house fires. Yet for families then, fireworks were a symbol of celebration, freedom, and excitement. Only later did laws clamp down on what could be sold, how it could be handled, and who was allowed to buy it. The memory of bottle rockets whizzing across yards and kids laughing as firecrackers popped underfoot is burned into nostalgia, even if today the thought of it makes people shudder. Playground equipment on concrete was one of the most unforgiving features of childhood in the 1970s. Jungle gyms, swings, seesaws, and monkey bars were bolted directly into asphalt or packed dirt. Kids climbed to dizzying heights, swung as far as they could, and when they fell, they hit hard. Scraped knees, bloody elbows, and broken bones were part of the package. Parents brushed it off as kids being kids, and teachers handed out bandages without calling an ambulance. Children dared each other to climb higher or jump farther, often taking risks that ended with painful falls. Merry-go-rounds spun so fast that kids were thrown across the blacktop, tumbling and laughing even through tears. Metal slides burned legs in summer heat, yet kids lined up for another turn. Playgrounds were meant to toughen children up, not cushion them. Metal slides baked in the summer sun, scorching bare legs, while merry-go-rounds spun children so fast they were flung off into the pavement. Today, safety codes require rubber mats, wood chips, and safer equipment. But in the 1970s, it was about adventure and risk. Looking back, it seems shocking that children were left to climb metal towers over concrete with no helmets or padding, but at the time it felt normal and even fun. Toys with small, swallowable parts and no warnings filled toy aisles in the 1970s. Board games came with marbles, dice, and plastic pieces tiny enough to choke a toddler, yet no packaging warned of hazards. Action figures often included detachable weapons, helmets, or accessories that kids could easily put in their mouths. Parents were expected to use common sense rather than rely on printed labels. Kids traded pieces, lost them in carpets, or carried them in pockets to school. It was not unusual for a toddler to sneak a toy from an older sibling and end up with a piece lodged in their mouth. Emergency rooms saw their share of choking incidents, yet toys remained unchanged for years. Parents often laughed about close calls, rather than demanding stricter safety laws. Inevitably, there were accidents, but they rarely led to sweeping changes. For children, the risk barely registered. It was just part of playtime. The lack of safety warnings reflected a broader cultural attitude: trust parents and kids to figure things out. Now every toy box is covered in age restrictions and bright caution labels, a direct response to decades of accidents. In the 1970s, though, those tiny pieces were just part of the fun, even if they occasionally led to trips to the emergency room. Lead paint still in homes and toys was one of the hidden dangers of the 1970s. Bright colors coated walls, cribs, and even children's blocks, with no awareness of the long-term risks. Parents proudly painted nurseries in cheerful hues, never realizing the paint chips could be toxic. Kids chewed on windowsills or toy edges without anyone suspecting harm. Lead made paint more durable and vibrant, which is why it was everywhere, in kitchens, schools, and playrooms. Children often scraped walls with toys, breaking off paint chips and putting them in their mouths out of curiosity. Parents swept up the flakes without worrying, treating it like harmless dust. The cheerful colors that brightened homes hid one of the most serious dangers of the decade. It was so common that no one thought twice about it. Later, studies revealed its devastating effects on children's health, especially on brain development. By the end of the decade, regulations began phasing it out, but in the early 1970s, it was still standard. Families now look back in shock, realizing how normal it was to grow up surrounded by something we now consider poison. Asbestos insulation in houses and schools was once hailed as a miracle material. Fireproof, cheap, and easy to install, it was used in walls, ceilings, and floor tiles across America. Schools were filled with it, and homes relied on it for insulation. No one questioned its safety. In fact, it was praised for protecting against fires. Kids sat in classrooms surrounded by asbestos panels, completely unaware of the danger. Maintenance workers handled it daily, stirring up dust that would later prove deadly. The risks were invisible, and that made them more insidious. By the time warnings became widespread, millions had been exposed. Today, asbestos removal is a costly and carefully regulated process, but in the 1970s, it was simply part of construction. What was once seen as progress is now remembered as one of the most hazardous building practices in modern history. Pesticide fog trucks driving through neighborhoods were a surreal but common sight in the 1970s. These trucks rolled slowly down suburban streets, spraying thick clouds of insecticide to fight mosquitoes and pests. Kids treated it like an event, running and biking through the mist as if it were a game. Children pretended they were racing through magical clouds, laughing as the thick fog wrapped around them, never realizing the danger. Parents stood on porches, waving as kids disappeared into the haze, assuming it was safe fun. The chemical smell clung to hair and clothes long after, becoming part of the memory. The sweet, chemical smell hung in the air, and parents rarely worried about what it meant. Communities trusted that if the government sent a truck, it must be safe. In reality, these sprays often contained chemicals now known to be harmful. The image of children laughing as they disappeared into white clouds of pesticide is both nostalgic and unsettling. At the time, it felt magical, like running through fog, but today it is seen as one of the more reckless habits of the era. Lawn chemicals with few restrictions were sold everywhere in the 1970s. Homeowners sprayed pesticides and herbicides across yards, often with children and pets nearby. Bright green lawns were a source of pride, and no one thought twice about the risks of chemical exposure. Many families saw a flawless lawn as a symbol of respectability, more important than any hidden risks. Kids would roll down hills coated in chemicals, their hands stained green by grass and residue. Even pets drank from puddles on freshly sprayed yards without anyone stopping them. Bags of fertilizer and weed killer came with little more than vague instructions, and protective gear was rarely used. Kids played tag on freshly treated grass, rolled in it, and sometimes even helped parents spread pellets. The cultural push for perfect lawns outweighed concerns about health or safety. Only years later did studies link many of these products to long-term health issues. Today, warnings, restrictions, and organic alternatives are common, but in the 1970s, it was all about appearance. Families remember the smell of fresh chemicals mixing with cut grass, a sensory detail now tinged with unease. Drinking fountains in schools with lead pipes were part of everyday life. Children lined up between classes to sip water that tasted slightly metallic, never questioning it. Schools built decades earlier often had plumbing filled with lead, and no one thought about what it meant for health. The water often had a sharp, tangy flavor that kids grew used to, chalking it up to school water. Teachers reminded children to drink plenty on hot days, believing they were doing good. No one realized those same sips carried unseen risks that would be banned later. Teachers encouraged kids to stay hydrated, believing the fountains were harmless. The reality is that generations of students were unknowingly exposed to lead through something as simple as drinking water. Regulations later forced replacements, but in the 1970s, the practice was widespread. The image of students leaning over chrome fountains, water dripping down their chins, is a nostalgic one, but also a reminder of how hidden dangers shape childhood in ways no one saw coming. Mercury thermometers in every home were a household staple. Slender glass tubes filled with shiny liquid mercury sat in medicine cabinets across the country. Parents shook them down with a snap of the wrist and placed them under tongues or arms to check for fevers. Children often marveled at the silver liquid, watching it roll smoothly inside the tube. Some kids even cracked them open on purpose, pushing the beads across tabletops like tiny toys. The shimmering globes split and reformed, sparking wonder instead of fear. Families simply swept them away or flushed them, never realizing the invisible danger left behind. Sometimes thermometers broke, and kids played with the tiny mercury beads as if they were toys. The danger of mercury poisoning was not widely understood, and cleanup often meant sweeping the beads into a dustpan or simply ignoring them. These thermometers were accurate and affordable, which is why they were everywhere. Today, digital alternatives have replaced them, but for families in the 1970s, the mercury thermometer was as common as aspirin. Looking back, the sight of that silver bead climbing the tube is remembered with a mix of comfort and alarm. Gasoline left in open containers was another ordinary hazard of the 1970s. People stored spare fuel in garages, sheds, or even glass jars without sealed lids. The strong smell filled the air, and kids often played nearby, oblivious to the danger. Sometimes children even dipped sticks into cans, lighting them like torches for fun. Jars tipped over easily, soaking floors with flammable puddles that adults casually wiped up. The risk of sparks from tools or cigarettes never crossed people's minds until disasters happened. It was seen as practical, having extra gas on hand for lawnmowers, cars, or emergencies. Plastic containers with safety spouts did not become common until much later. Back then, cans often leaked, tipped over, or sat open in the heat, creating enormous fire risks. Families accepted it as normal, part of maintaining a household. Only in hindsight does it seem shocking how casually people treated something so volatile. For many, the smell of gasoline in a garage is a powerful memory of childhood, both nostalgic and unsettling given what we now know. Glass soda bottles returned by kids for cash were a cornerstone of everyday life in the 1970s. Families bought soda in heavy glass bottles, and when the drinks were gone, it was the kids' job to haul them back to the corner store or local grocery. Children carried rattling crates filled with glass bottles, clinking together as they walked down sidewalks or pedaled bikes with baskets overloaded. At the store, the bottles were exchanged for a few cents each, turning empty soda into pocket money for candy or comic books. Parents encouraged it, partly because it kept kids busy, but also because it saved money on the next soda purchase. The bottles were reused and refilled, long before recycling became mainstream, which made the system practical and efficient. The danger was obvious, though. Heavy glass bottles cracked or shattered easily, and kids often ended up with cuts or bruises. Even so, it was a point of pride to carry the bottles back without breaking any, and the sound of coins dropping into small hands was a sweet reward. Today, this practice would be considered risky, especially letting children lug around crates of breakable glass. But for those who grew up then, the memory of glass bottles clinking together in the summer heat is unforgettable, tied to independence, responsibility, and the simple joy of earning a little money for themselves. Second-hand car seats from the junkyard were not just an option in the 1970s, they were common practice. Families with tight budgets often skipped buying new car seats and instead picked up old ones at thrift stores, garage sales, or even straight from junkyards. The idea of expiration dates, safety testing, or regulations barely existed, and parents assumed that as long as a seat looked sturdy, it was good enough. Some were nothing more than plastic shells with thin straps, designed more for convenience than actual protection. Infants and toddlers sat in them on long drives, bouncing around without the security we expect today. Parents believed they were doing the responsible thing by having some sort of car seat, even if it had been passed down for years or scavenged secondhand. The truth is, those seats offered little real protection in an accident, but few people knew that then. Safety campaigns were still in their infancy, and buying brand new seats was often too expensive for working families. Looking back, it feels shocking to think of babies riding around in second-hand car seats with fraying straps or missing parts, but at the time, it was simply practical. Those old seats symbolize both the resourcefulness and the risks of parenting in the 1970s. Dramatically flammable pajamas were another hazard hiding in plain sight. Children's sleepwear in the 1970s was often made from synthetic fabrics like nylon or polyester, which looked sleek and washed easily, but carried a hidden danger. They ignited quickly. Parents bought them in bright colors and fun patterns, never realizing how dangerous they could be. Bedtime routines involved kids running around in their pajamas, sometimes near fireplaces, candles, or stoves, and the risk of catching fire was real. There were heartbreaking stories of burns that eventually pushed regulators to demand flame-resistant fabrics. But before those rules took hold, kids went to bed each night in pajamas that could turn deadly in seconds. Parents saw them as practical, affordable, and durable, which is why they were so popular. Children remember the feel of those synthetic fabrics, slippery, shiny, sometimes even sparking with static electricity in winter. The pajamas themselves became part of the era's fashion, with designs of superheroes, cartoon characters, and colorful stripes. Today, strict safety standards require flame-retardant sleepwear for children, but back then, no one thought twice about it. For families of the 1970s, those pajamas were just part of the bedtime ritual, never realizing the risks that lay hidden in the fabric itself. Spray paint sold without age limits was a curious mix of creativity and danger. In the 1970s, cans of spray paint lined hardware store shelves, and anyone, kids, teenagers, or adults, could buy them freely. There were no restrictions, no warnings about misuse, and no one asking for identification at checkout. For many kids, spray paint was simply a tool for school projects, model kits, or art experiments. But it also became a temptation for graffiti, vandalism, and even dangerous inhalation. The fumes were strong and often overwhelming, yet kids used them in closed garages or basements without masks or ventilation. Some experimented with huffing, inhaling the chemicals in ways that were not only harmful, but sometimes fatal. Communities eventually caught on, and laws were passed to limit access, but in the 1970s, spray paint felt like just another household product. The rattling ball inside the can, the hiss of paint spraying out, and the smell of chemicals in the air are all tied to the memory of the time. Parents rarely worried as long as the paint was used responsibly and stores were unconcerned with who bought it. Looking back, The lack of restrictions seems unbelievable, but it reflects how differently people viewed risk and responsibility in that era. Hair dryers with no grounding or auto shutoff were another silent danger hiding in homes. These devices were everywhere in the 1970s, sitting on vanities or plugged in near sinks, often with frayed cords and little regard for safety. Women and men alike relied on them daily, blasting hot air through metal coils that heated instantly. There were no automatic shutoff features, no ground fault protection, and little insulation against shocks. If the dryer overheated, it could catch fire. If it was dropped into water, the results were catastrophic. Yet no one thought much of it because these appliances were marketed as safe and modern. Teens used them before school, parents before work, and stylists in salons all day long. They were loud, heavy, and sometimes left hair smelling faintly scorched, but they did the job. Fires started, accidents happened, and people learned to be cautious only after experiencing close calls. Today's dryers are lightweight, insulated, and equipped with layers of safety features, but in the 1970s, none of that existed. Looking back, it is chilling to imagine how casually people used devices that could turn dangerous so quickly. But for families of that era, the hairdryer was just another trusted tool in the daily routine, taken for granted despite its hidden risks. Hitchhiking was once seen as adventurous, not reckless. People stuck out their thumbs with a smile and a sign, hoping for a ride and maybe a story. Soldiers on leave, college students on break, wanderers with a dream, they all relied on the kindness of strangers. Roads were filled with possibilities, and nobody thought twice about pulling over. You might remember watching someone hop into a stranger's car and wave goodbye, trusting the road and the driver. It was how many got from one town to the next, especially before cheap bus fares and ride-sharing apps. Parents might warn you to be careful, but that was the extent of the worry. Hitchhiking was not illegal in most places, it was resourceful. Over time, though, stories of assaults, disappearances, and crimes changed the narrative. Laws tightened, signs went up, no hitchhiking. Now, in many states, it is restricted or outright banned. The open road closed itself off. Hitchhiking became a symbol of risk rather than freedom. But for those who once stuck out their thumb and caught a ride with a stranger, it still lives in memory as a gesture of trust. And just as strangers were trusted, so were quiet children waiting patiently in cars, alone. Airline smoking sections were not just allowed in the 1950s, they were expected. Planes had ashtrays built into armrests, and passengers lit up mid-flight as if they were sitting in a diner. Families with children sat only a row or two away, with no barriers to stop the smoke from drifting everywhere. At the time, smoking was so ingrained in American culture that banning it would have seemed unimaginable. Flight attendants passed out matches and sometimes even complimentary packs of cigarettes, adding to the surreal image of a cabin filled with smoke at 30,000 feet. Travelers accepted the haze as part of the experience, and the lingering smell of tobacco clung to clothes and luggage long after landing. By the 1980s, however, the dangers of secondhand smoke could no longer be ignored, and bans were gradually put in place. Today, the idea of sparking a cigarette on a crowded flight is absurd and heavily penalized. But in the 1950s, the smoking section was a symbol of modern convenience and freedom, not a health hazard. Looking back, it is astonishing how quickly norms shifted. What was once a routine part of travel is now remembered as a shocking relic of a different era, a time when passengers puffed away in tight cabins without thinking twice. Clackers were two acrylic or glass balls tied to a string and handed to children with no safety warnings and a full green light. You'd hold the middle of the string, swing the balls upward and downward until they collided above and below your hand, producing that iconic clack-clack sound. It looked simple. It sounded addictive. It was also a hazard waiting to happen. The plastic versions could chip. The glass ones could shatter. And if you missed your rhythm, one ball went rogue, swinging at eyebrow height with all the grace of a wrecking ball. Kids practiced for hours, trying to get the timing right, turning every playground into a percussion concert of risk. Parents shrugged. Teachers banned them. Hospitals stocked up on ice packs and gauze. But still, they were cool. Until one clack too many ended in sharp pieces flying through the air. Eventually, safety commissions pulled them off shelves. But back then, one broken pair just meant you were in the market for another. And if that seemed dangerous, wait till you hear about people putting flammable foam containers directly onto gas stoves like it was just another Tuesday. Because in 1969, Pan American Airlines launched a waiting list for commercial flights to the moon. No joke. People were lining up to get their names on this list. The idea was simple. We made it to the moon, so the next logical step was to sell tickets. Over 90,000 people signed up, excited about the idea of sipping martinis in zero gravity and watching the Earth rise outside their window. And Pan Am treated it like a real thing. They issued membership cards, called it the First Moon Flights Club, and promised that when the day came, they would call. The only problem? There was no plan, no actual timeline, no spaceship. It was a publicity stunt that spiraled out of control. People bought into the dream hard, and Pan Am was not about to correct them. When the company went bankrupt in the 1980s, it had never even started building anything to take people to space. The dream fizzled out, but it proved just how hungry the world was for a taste of the future. And nowhere was that hunger more obvious than in people's homes, where they tried to bring cinema magic to life with a machine the size of a small refrigerator. In the 1980s, parents often left kids home alone for entire evenings, or even overnight. A 12-year-old babysitter was considered responsible enough to watch younger siblings while adults went out. Sometimes, kids as young as 10 were left to handle the house until morning. Parents trusted their children in ways that feel shocking today. Instructions were simple. Lock the doors, do not answer the phone, and call a neighbor if anything happened. Pizza delivery filled the gaps, and television kept kids entertained late into the night. Of course, the risks were real. Fires, accidents, or emergencies could leave kids in difficult situations. But the culture valued independence, and leaving children home alone was seen as part of growing up. Kids bragged about being trusted to hold down the fort, wearing it as a badge of maturity. Today, leaving a child alone overnight could result in legal trouble. But in the 1980s, it was routine. Do you remember the thrill of being the responsible one in charge of the house, even if you were just 12? Pregnant women drinking and smoking publicly in the 1950s was not only accepted, it was practically expected in some social circles. Cigarettes were marketed as stress relievers, and alcohol was considered a normal part of dinner or social gatherings. You could walk into a restaurant and see expectant mothers enjoying cocktails with friends, or standing outside department stores smoking a cigarette without anyone batting an eye. It was not until the 1960s and beyond that serious studies showed the dangers of fetal alcohol syndrome and low birth weights from smoking during pregnancy. But in the 1950s, women who were expecting a child were not shielded from cigarettes or liquor at all. Looking back now, it feels almost surreal that society normalized these practices, but for millions of families at the time, it was just another part of daily life. Today, a pregnant woman drinking or smoking in public would spark outrage, but in the 1950s, it was totally normal. Smoking was everywhere in the 1980s, not just on sidewalks or street corners, but inside diners, airplanes, grocery stores, even hospitals. Ashtrays were bolted to fast food tables. The clink of ice in a glass mixed with the flick of a lighter. Office meetings were held through a fog of cigarette smoke. Passengers lit up at 30,000 feet in a sealed cabin, and nobody said a word. There were smoking sections in restaurants, but no real barriers. Just a vague separation by aisle or air vent. It was part of the scenery, part of the culture. But today, smoking indoors is banned in most public spaces across the United States. What once symbolized adulthood now reads as a health hazard. But at the time, it was just background noise, something that hung in the curtains and clung to your coat. And if the air in those spaces was thick with smoke, it was also filled with something else that seems almost unbelievable now: medicine sold without oversight. Chemistry sets in the 1960s were less about learning formulas and more about dodging danger with every experiment. These kits came with powders, acids, glass tubes, and, wait for it, alcohol burners. Real ones. You'd light a flame with a match, pour flammable liquids into little dishes, and watch as something fizzed, foamed, or went up in smoke. It was thrilling, chaotic, and completely normal. Instructions were vague at best and safety gear optional at most. Kids could melt plastic, set fire to paper, or accidentally discover the smell of burnt eyebrows. These were sold as educational tools, but really they were training grounds for pyromaniacs. You'd mix mystery powders just to see what color they turned, or if they'd explode. Parents watched from a distance, maybe keeping a glass of water nearby just in case. The burners themselves were tiny metal cups with open flames that danced like tiny bonfires across your kitchen table. One wrong move and suddenly your science project doubled as a fire drill. And if you didn't lose an eyebrow there, you might lose an eye to the next toy on the list, because clackers weren't just noisy, they were downright dangerous. In the 1980s, the sight of first graders walking to school alone was unremarkable. Entire groups of children, barely 6 or 7 years old, marched down sidewalks with backpacks bouncing, chatting, and laughing without a single adult in sight. It was a matter of practicality. Parents worked early shifts, buses did not always cover every street, and walking was the simplest solution. Crossing busy roads with no crossing guard was considered part of growing up. Children learned independence with every step, even when it meant braving rain or snow. Strangers waved as kids passed, shop owners looked out from storefronts, and neighbors trusted the community to keep watch. Parents did not worry about constant supervision the way they do today. By the time children reached 4th grade, walking alone was practically expected. Now, letting a 6-year-old walk a few blocks alone can lead to intervention from authorities. Looking back, it is amazing how normal it once was to see children managing themselves in the big world. Do you remember the pride of making it to school on your own 2 feet? Ah yes, Sinclair's home chemistry lab sets. Nothing says wholesome childhood fun like handing 10-year-olds real acids, flammable powders, and the ability to create small explosions in the garage. In the early 1960s, these kits were everywhere. Marketed as educational, they were part science, part spectacle. Kids could grow crystals, mix glowing liquids, and experiment with reactions that would make any science teacher twitch. But the truth? These kits were a ticking time bomb. Figuratively and sometimes literally. They included potassium nitrate, sulfur, and other compounds that today would be locked in a school lab under triple-sealed storage. There were instructions for creating mini smoke bombs, acids that could burn through metal, and even chemical reactions that, if mixed incorrectly, could send a glass beaker flying across the room. Lawsuits started piling in. So did safety warnings. By the end of the decade, the most dangerous sets were pulled from shelves, and future versions were watered down to the point of being glorified food coloring. Still, for a brief window of time, American kids had access to a fully stocked chemical arsenal. But if you think a little sulfur was intense, you should smell what came next. And no, it wasn't roses. Smoking sections in schools and offices might sound shocking today, but in the 1950s, it was just part of daily life. Teachers smoked at their desks while grading papers, and office workers puffed away during meetings. Students in high schools even had designated smoking areas outdoors, sometimes with faculty supervision. The idea of banning smoking indoors would have seemed outrageous at the time. Today, the thought of smoking in a school or office is unthinkable and strictly illegal. What once symbolized modern living and professional identity is now remembered as one of the most harmful and careless practices of the era. Looking back, it feels surreal that children once walked through clouds of smoke at school, and office meetings resembled smoky lounges. Buying cold medicine used to be as easy as grabbing a candy bar. In the 1980s, if you had a stuffy nose, you walked into the drugstore, picked up a box of Sudafed, paid in cash, and left. No questions asked, no identification, no tracking. Parents sent their kids to buy it. It was just medicine, part of every household. But the main ingredient in many of those over-the-counter remedies, pseudoephedrine, was later linked to illegal methamphetamine production. By the early 2000s, laws changed. Now, you need to show identification, sign a logbook, and face strict limits on how much you can buy. The shelves are locked. The trust is gone. And what used to be a quick stop for relief has turned into a regulated transaction. But before children were regulated at pharmacies, they were doing something else just as shocking in the family car, standing tall while it moved. Polystyrene cup noodle warmers were the product of instant gratification and zero caution. Before microwave noodles were common, people would boil water and pour it straight into a foam cup filled with dehydrated soup. But for the especially impatient or inventive, the next step was balancing that foam cup directly onto a gas burner to keep it hot. Polystyrene, in case you're wondering, is highly flammable, as in melts, warps, and ignites at low heat, kind of flammable. So what happened? The bottom would bubble, the sides would sag, and occasionally the whole thing would catch fire, turning dinner into a miniature inferno. The smell of scorched styrofoam was unforgettable and extremely unhealthy, but people kept doing it. Kids copied their parents, placing their cup of noodles just a little too close to the open flame and watching in awe as the foam darkened and shrank. Eventually, warnings were printed, packaging changed, and microwaves saved us from ourselves. But for one hot moment, dinner meant dodging a kitchen fire. And if that was not festive enough, holiday decorating added its own flair, with a snow spray that came with a cloud of toxic cheer. Back before Halloween became a yearly anxiety fest, taking unmarked candy from a neighbor was just how the night worked. You rang a doorbell, yelled, "Trick or treat," and got handed whatever someone had lying around. Loose jelly beans? Great. Homemade fudge and wax paper? Even better. The idea that candy needed to be sealed and tamper-proof had not fully caught on yet. No one was worried about needles or poison. Your biggest fear was getting a box of raisins. Parents did not comb through your haul under a flashlight. They just told you not to eat it all at once. The neighbor handing out popcorn balls or wrapped caramels was not suspicious. They were the cool house. Trust was the currency of the neighborhood, and if someone put effort into a treat, you respected it. Now, we wrap everything in layers of packaging and double-check labels like candy is a security threat. And after all that sugar buzz, you already knew where the real party was, under a disco ball, skates on, and lyrics your parents probably should have listened to more closely. The 4th of July in the 1980s meant fireworks, and kids had no trouble buying them. Roadside stands sold Roman candles, bottle rockets, and sometimes even M80s to children with just a few dollars in their pocket. The thrill of walking up to a wooden shack filled with explosives was part of the holiday. Parents often turned a blind eye. Some even sent their kids to buy the fireworks while they got the grill ready. No ID, no rules, just the cash exchange and a paper bag full of sparks and danger. It was almost a childhood tradition to light fireworks with little or no adult supervision. Of course, accidents were common. Burns, lost fingers, and neighborhood fires were part of the risk, but the culture shrugged it off as kids being kids. By today's standards, the idea of handing powerful fireworks to unsupervised children feels reckless, but in the 1980s, it was normal. Looking back, it is both nostalgic and unsettling to remember how casually fireworks were sold to kids. The freedom felt exhilarating, but the danger was always one wrong move away. Do you remember clutching a bag of bottle rockets like it was treasure? Drinking alcohol while driving was not only common in the 1950s, it was often seen as harmless. Many states had no open container laws, meaning drivers could sip a beer or a cocktail on the road without legal consequence. Law enforcement generally turned a blind eye unless someone was visibly drunk, and even then the punishments were lighter than what we would consider appropriate today. Families often thought nothing of it, with kids in the back seat while parents enjoyed a drink up front. It was only as accidents mounted and drunk driving became recognized as a national crisis that laws began to change. Today, the idea of drinking alcohol behind the wheel is unthinkable and harshly punished. In the 1950s, however, It was just another extension of the era's more carefree and less regulated lifestyle. What once seemed ordinary now feels dangerous and reckless, but back then it was part of everyday American culture. Riding bikes without helmets was not considered dangerous. It was considered growing up. Children in the 1980s owned scraped knees, stubbed toes, and chipped teeth like badges of honor. You grabbed your bike and took off the moment the sun came up, racing friends through alleys, sidewalks, and backyards. The wind whipped your face. The world blurred past. Helmets were rare. If anyone had one, it was likely for motocross or medical reasons. Most parents did not even think to suggest it. Bike safety was taught through scraped elbows, not pamphlets. You rode with your shoelaces untied, your backpack swinging, maybe even one hand holding a soda. Some bikes had pegs, others had banana seats, but almost none had helmets. Today, many states have helmet laws, especially for children under 18. Schools give lessons. Parents buy reflective gear. But for that earlier generation, the only thing protecting your head was your luck and your reflexes. It was risky, yes, but also exhilarating. And while today's parents would call that neglect, the freedom to take risks was part of what made childhood feel so vast. Just like thumbing a ride down the highway felt like part of growing up for teenagers and travelers alike. Home hair dryers in the 1960s looked like they came straight from a beauty salon, but without any of the safety checks. These early models had bulky hoods or handheld nozzles, often with thick cords that frayed faster than a worn shoelace. You'd plug them into the wall, perch near the bathroom sink, and hope for the best. No ground wires, no insulation. Just you, your wet hair, and a live current a sneeze away from disaster. The metal casing got hot. The motors sparked occasionally. And heaven help you if your fingers were damp. Water plus faulty wiring? That hairdo could turn into a fireworks show. Yet people trusted them because that sleek salon look felt worth the risk. Back then, it was just another day in the name of glamour. But if electricity was playing with fire, what we put directly on wounds wasn't much better, especially when it came in a bright red bottle with a mercury surprise. Halloween nights in the 1980s stretched on for hours. Kids wandered neighborhoods long after the streetlights flickered on, sometimes staying out until midnight. Parents rarely tagged along. Halloween was for children, and adults stayed home to hand out candy. Groups of kids walked miles away from home, crossing busy streets, climbing porch steps, and filling pillowcases with candy until they were too heavy to carry. Older kids pranked each other with shaving cream, toilet paper, and eggs, while younger ones ran from house to house without supervision. The darkness only added to the thrill. Strangers' houses were fair game. No one questioned whether the candy was safe, and no one checked in every hour by phone. Parents trusted kids to return when they were done, even if that meant after midnight. Today, trick-or-treating hours are often capped early in the evening, with parents following close behind and flashlights lighting the path. Looking back, the freedom was exhilarating, but the risks are hard to ignore. Do you remember dragging home a pillowcase so stuffed with candy it nearly ripped? Imagine a time when the centerpiece of every living room was a bulky, boxy behemoth, the CRT TV. Coming into prominence in the 1950s, this technological marvel turned the humble living room into a bustling family theater. Picture the excitement as families gathered around to watch the moon landing or the latest episode of I Love Lucy. Despite its hefty frame, the CRT TV was the window to the world, until the sleek and slender flat screens of the early 2000s gently nudged it into the annals of history. Yet, ask any vintage video game enthusiast, and they'll wax poetic about the unmatched charm of playing on a CRT. Before streaming in HD, the CRT TV was the family's bond, the newsbringer, and the entertainer, all rolled into one. Riding in the back of pickup trucks was a familiar sight in the 1950s. Especially in small towns and rural areas. Kids piled into the truck bed, sitting on the wheel wells or standing while the vehicle rolled down highways and dirt roads. Parents often saw it as harmless fun, and children loved the sense of freedom and adventure. Families used trucks not just for hauling, but for transportation when space inside was limited. After church on Sundays, after-school ball games, or weekend errands, kids climbed into the back without question. At the time, there were no laws against it, and police officers rarely raised an eyebrow. Safety campaigns had not yet highlighted the risks, and seatbelt laws were still decades away. The wind in your hair, the wide-open sky, and the thrill of standing while moving at 40 miles per hour created lasting memories for many who grew up in that era. Today, such behavior is considered reckless and illegal in most states. Modern parents would never allow their children to ride unsecured in the back of a moving truck. But in the 1950s, it was part of daily life, something kids looked forward to rather than feared. The contrast is striking, and it shows just how much ideas of safety and responsibility have evolved in less than a lifetime. DIY asbestos home repairs were once a weekend project, not a professional hazard. In the 1980s, homeowners took pride in doing it themselves, scraping tiles, pulling down insulation, cutting through old cement boards with their bare hands and maybe a dust mask, if that. Asbestos was everywhere, in popcorn ceilings, vinyl floor tiles, wall insulation, pipe wrap. It was cheap, durable, and deadly, though few knew how deadly. People inhaled fibers while remodeling bathrooms, sanding attic walls, or tearing out old basements. There were no warning stickers, no hazmat suits. You might remember helping your parents renovate, the air cloudy with dust and the room echoing with the sound of tools. What you could not see were the microscopic particles entering your lungs. Decades later, asbestos exposure was linked to serious illnesses like mesothelioma and lung cancer. Today, it is illegal in many building materials, and removal requires certified professionals and safety protocols. But back then, it was just part of fixing up the house. The risks were invisible, the consequences delayed. And as much as the air inside homes was quietly dangerous, people also put themselves at risk under the sun, slathered in baby oil and chasing the perfect tan. Television antennas in the 1960s were a test of both engineering skill and sheer audacity. You'd climb up on the roof with a giant metal rod, twist it until the static cleared, and shout down to someone inside for feedback. A little to the left. No, now it's worse. Back the other way. It was like guiding a spaceship with zero safety precautions. Most of these antennas weren't grounded properly. That meant if lightning struck, and it did, it would travel straight through the antenna, down the roof, and into your home. More than one dad became an unexpected conductor trying to adjust the Sunday game signal mid-storm. Even without lightning, a fall from the roof was a very real danger. These weren't lightweight aluminum poles. They were heavy, sharp-edged contraptions bolted to chimneys or mounted precariously with hopes and prayers. Some families installed them with rope and ladders. Others just sent up the most agile family member. Signal boosts meant the difference between watching your favorite show and enduring snow-filled fuzz, so the risk seemed worth it. But what started as a harmless adjustment often turned into a near-death experience. And if you think the antenna was risky, just wait until you remember the glue that smelled so strong it knocked kids out before the models were even finished. Step into a restaurant in the 1980s, and it would not take long for smoke to hit your face. Entire families sat at tables eating dinner while the next table over puffed away on cigarettes. Ashtrays sat on every surface, and the air was thick with haze that today would be unthinkable. It was not just restaurants. Parents smoked in cars with the windows rolled up while kids sat in the back seat, coughing quietly. Grocery stores had shoppers strolling down the aisles with a cigarette hanging from their lips as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Children often carried the smell of smoke in their hair and clothes no matter where they went. Health warnings were starting to appear, but they were drowned out by the cultural acceptance of smoking everywhere. Non-smokers had little choice but to breathe it in, whether they liked it or not. Smoking sections in restaurants existed, but they were often nothing more than a line of booths separating smokers from non-smokers, with smoke floating freely between them. Looking back, it is astonishing to think that families once tolerated meals eaten in a cloud of secondhand smoke. What was considered everyday life then is illegal in most places now. Do you remember when restaurants handed you an ashtray before they handed you a menu? It is wild to think how many everyday things from the 1970s would break the rules today. So tell us which one shocked you most in the comments. Hit like if it stirred a memory, and subscribe to keep uncovering the past that shaped us.